My name is Rick Thompson, and I own Thompson Music Supply in Seattle from 1989 to 2001. We specialized in providing instruments and accessories to the local music scene during the height of grunge. In those days, Seattle was the center of the musical universe, and my shop was where many of the biggest names came for their equipment needs. Kurt Cobain first walked into my store in early 1991, just as Nirvana was starting to explode nationally. He was soft-spoken, polite, and very specific about his equipment preferences. Unlike many musicians who experimented with different brands and gauges, Kurt was remarkably consistent in his orders. But that consistency became something much darker in his final year. Let me start by explaining guitar string basics, because understanding this is crucial to the story. Guitar strings come in different gauges, thicknesses measured in thousandths of an inch. Light gauge strings, like .009s, are easier to play and bend, while heavy gauge strings, like .012s or .013s, require more finger strength but produce fuller tone and higher tension. Most electric guitar players, especially those playing aggressive rock music, prefer medium gauges around .010 or .011. These provide a good balance of playability and tone without requiring excessive finger strength. Kurt typically ordered Ernie Ball regular slinky sets, .010, .013, .017, .026, .036, .046. Standard stuff for a rock guitarist. He'd come in every 2 to 3 weeks, buy 4 or 5 sets, sometimes chat about music or equipment, then leave. Normal customer behavior, but sometime in early 1993, his ordering pattern began to change. Instead of his usual mixed gauge sets, Kurt started requesting specific individual strings. Always the same, .013 gauge plain steel strings. Not wound strings, not bass strings, just the plain steel .013s that are typically used for the B string on an electric guitar at AT first. I assumed he was breaking B strings frequently. Some players attack that string harder than others, especially when playing power chords or bending notes aggressively. I didn't think much of it. Breaking a lot of B strings lately? I asked during one visit in March 1993. Kurt paused, looking almost startled by the question. Yeah, something like that. I need them for different tunings. That made sense. Alternative tunings can put unusual stress on specific strings, causing them to break more often. Kurt was known for experimenting with different tunings, so I ordered extra .013s to keep in stock for him. But as 1993 progressed, Kurt's orders became increasingly strange. Instead of buying 4 or 5 individual .013 strings, he'd request 20 or 30 at a time. Far more than any guitarist would need, even if they were breaking strings constantly. Planning to restring a lot of guitars. I joked during one particularly large order. Something like that, Kurt replied, but he looked uncomfortable, almost guilty. I'm working on some projects. By late 1993, Kurt was ordering .013 strings in quantities that made no musical sense. 50 or 60 strings at a time, always the same gauge, always plain steel. When I suggested he might save money by buying in bulk directly from the manufacturer, he insisted on continuing to purchase through my shop. I like supporting local business, he said, but there was something else in his voice, like he needed the personal interaction. the routine of coming to the store, the normalcy of a simple transaction. What made these orders even stranger was Kurt's behavior during the purchases. He'd become increasingly agitated and distracted, often forgetting to take his change or leaving strings on the counter. Sometimes he'd start to leave, then come back and buy more strings, as if he'd suddenly remembered something important. In December 1993, Kurt placed his largest string order yet, 100.013 gauge plain steel strings. I had to special order them, which took 2 weeks to arrive. When Kurt came to pick them up, he looked terrible, gaunt, pale, with dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in weeks. "That's a lot of strings," I commented, hoping to lighten the mood. "You starting a guitar string business?" Kurt looked at me with an expression I'll never forget. Not anger, but something deeper and sadder. "I'm just preparing for things to end." At the time, I thought he meant Nirvana was breaking up or that he was planning to stop performing. The band had been through a lot of turmoil, and Kurt had been vocal about his frustrations with fame and the music industry. But looking back, I realized he was talking about something much more final. Throughout early 1994, Kurt's string orders continued at an alarming pace. Every few days, he'd come in and buy 20 or 30 more .013s. I started keeping a larger inventory just to meet his demand, though I couldn't understand what he was doing with so many strings. "Are you teaching guitar classes or something?" I asked in February 1994. "I can't figure out why you need so many of the same string." Kurt was quiet for a long moment, staring at the strings in his hands. "They're not all for guitars," he said finally. "Some things need stronger material than you'd think." That comment bothered me for days. What would Kurt Cobain need guitar strings for besides playing guitar? I considered various possibilities: art projects, home repairs, hanging pictures, but none of them made sense given the quantities he was purchasing. In March 1994, Kurt's visits became even more frequent and erratic. He'd sometimes come in twice in one day, buying strings in the morning and returning in the evening for more. His behavior was increasingly agitated, and he'd often mutter to himself while examining the strings. During one visit, I overheard him counting under his breath, 15, 16, 17, how many do I need? Maybe 20? Better get 30 to be safe. Safe for what? I asked, genuinely concerned about his state of mind. Kurt looked startled, as if he'd forgotten I was there. "Nothing. Just making sure I have enough." "Enough for what, Kurt? You're buying more strings than some music stores stock. What's going on?" He stared at me for several seconds, and I could see him struggling with whether to say something. Finally, he spoke. "Have you ever felt like you were trapped in a box, and the only way out was to break something important?" I didn't understand what he meant then. I thought he was talking metaphorically about his career or his marriage or the pressures of fame. I told him that everyone feels trapped sometimes, that things usually work out if you give them time. Kurt nodded, but I could tell he wasn't really listening. He paid for his strings and left without another word. The last time I saw Kurt Cobain was April 2nd, 1994, 3 days before he died. He came into the shop around closing time, looking more agitated than I'd ever seen him. He bought 40.013 gauge strings, his largest single-day purchase, and several packages of string winders, tools used to quickly tighten strings to proper tension. Going to be doing a lot of restringing? I asked, trying to make conversation. Testing tension, Kurt replied cryptically. Need to make sure they'll hold. Hold what? Kurt looked at me with an expression that was almost apologetic. The weight of everything. Those were the last words Kurt Cobain ever spoke to me. 3 days later, on April 5, 1994, Kurt was found dead in the greenhouse above his garage. The official cause of death was suicide by shotgun, but what wasn't widely reported was the collection of guitar strings found throughout the house. When the police contacted me as part of their investigation into Kurt's final days, I learned details that made my blood run cold. They'd found dozens of .013 gauge strings in Kurt's bedroom, some tied into nooses of various sizes, others arranged in lengths suggesting he'd been testing their strength and durability. It became clear that Kurt had been practicing. 4 months, possibly longer, he'd been using guitar strings to experiment with hanging methods. The quantities he'd been buying, the obsession with that specific gauge, the comments about tension and weight, it all made horrible sense. Detective Mills, who was investigating Kurt's death, explained that .013 gauge strings are ideal for hanging because they're strong enough to support body weight but thin enough to be concealed easily. They don't stretch like rope, and they cut quickly through skin, making the process faster and more certain. Did Mr. Cobain ever mention suicide directly? Detective Mills asked that I told him about Kurt's increasingly strange behavior, his comments about being trapped, his need to break something important. But I also mentioned something that bothered me about the official suicide narrative. Kurt had always been left-handed, playing guitar left-handed and writing left-handed. But the nooses found in his house were all tied with right-hand knot patterns. When I pointed this out to Detective Mills, he made a note but said it wasn't significant enough to change the investigation's conclusions. But I knew Kurt's hands, his finger strength, his dexterity. I'd watched him handle delicate guitar work for 3 years. The idea that he would suddenly start tying complex knots with his non-dominant hand didn't make sense to me. Over the following months, I replayed every interaction I'd had with Kurt during his final year. The string orders that made no musical sense. The comments about testing tension and holding weight. The gradual transformation from a musician buying supplies to someone preparing for death. But there were also inconsistencies that troubled me. Kurt's final string purchase included string winders, tools that are used for tuning and tensioning strings on instruments. If he was planning to hang himself, why would he need tools designed for musical applications? And there was something else. Kurt had also been ordering unusual gauge strings throughout 1993 and early 1994, but not for guitars. He'd occasionally buy very heavy gauge bass strings, .100 or .110 thickness, that were far too large for any guitar application. When I mentioned this to Detective Mills, he suggested that Kurt might have been planning multiple suicide methods or that he was simply confused about what he needed. But I knew Kurt well enough to know he was never confused about musical equipment, that I started to wonder if someone else had been directing Kurt's string purchases. Someone who understood that guitar strings could be used for hanging, but didn't understand the specific musical applications well enough to choose appropriate gauges. 3 months after Kurt's death, I was contacted by a private investigator named Tom Grant, who had been hired by Courtney Love to find Kurt before his death was discovered. Grant was re-examining evidence from the case and was particularly interested in Kurt's final purchases and behavior, When I told Grant about the guitar string orders, he was immediately suspicious. Kurt was right-hand when it came to writing and fine motor skills, Grant explained. But all the hanging preparation evidence was consistent with someone who was right-hand doing the work. Grant also pointed out that the quantities of strings Kurt had purchased were far more than needed for suicide preparation. Even if someone was practicing extensively, they wouldn't need hundreds of strings. Unless what? Unless someone else was doing the practicing, and Kurt was just the supplier. That possibility haunted me. Had Kurt been unknowingly purchasing materials for his own murder? Had someone convinced him that the strings were for musical projects while using them to plan his death? I'll never know for certain what happened to Kurt Cobain. The official investigation concluded suicide, and that's where it ended. But as the person who supplied the materials that may have been used in his death, I can tell you that the pattern of purchases didn't match the behavior of someone planning his own suicide. Kurt's string orders were methodical, systematic, and involved far more material than any individual would need. They suggested planning by someone with detailed knowledge of hanging techniques, but limited understanding of musical equipment. Whether Kurt died by suicide or murder, I played a role in providing the materials that ended his life. That knowledge has haunted me for 30 years. And it's why I eventually closed my music store and left Seattle. Sometimes the most innocent transactions can become part of the darkest moments in people's lives. And sometimes, the signs of what's coming are right in front of you, but you don't recognize them until it's too late.